The moment Jin walked onto the private flight bound for Los Angeles, the cabin crew straightened instinctively. He wore an expression carved from cold marble, as if nothing in the world could move him. Tall, sharply dressed, effortlessly intimidating, even without knowing his name, anyone could sense he held power that lived in shadows. But power meant nothing to his son. Minho, 8 years old, clung to Jin's sleeve like a small shadow. He didn't make eye contact with anyone, didn't speak. Crowds overwhelmed him. Airports terrified him. Today had already been a battle. Boarding the plane, a war. That's when she appeared. A soft voice, a warm smile, a calm presence in navy blue. Aisha Collins, one of the flight attendants, approached with a careful, respectful step. A black woman in her late 20s, her posture carried a mix of grace and authority, like someone who'd learned how to hold worlds together quietly. "Hi there," she said gently, crouching to Minho's height without getting too close. "Can I show you something cool?" Minho blinked. Jin stiffened, not out of anger, but surprise. No one talked to Minho like that. No one ever tried. Hours later, mid-flight, when Jin rolled the dessert cart toward his son and said, "Minho, choose a dessert. Anything you want?" The boy didn't look at the food. He looked at her. He pointed, directly at the flight attendant. The room froze. "Welcome to Korean Mafia lovers. Hey there. Please let us know where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you these stories." Jin's reputation preceded him everywhere he went. In Seoul's underground circles, his name was whispered with equal parts respect and fear. The youngest head of the organization, he'd built an empire through calculated moves and unwavering control. But none of that mattered when it came to his son. Minho sat rigidly in the plush airplane seat, his small hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. The 8-year-old's dark eyes darted nervously around the cabin, taking in every sound, every movement, every unfamiliar face. His breathing came in short, shallow bursts. "Minho-ya," Jin murmured softly, his voice a stark contrast to the commanding tone he used in boardrooms. "Remember what Dr. Kim taught you, deep breaths." The boy tried, but his shoulders remained tense. Jin's jaw tightened with helpless frustration. 3 years of therapy, countless specialists, and Minho still struggled with crowds, loud noises, and new environments. The autism diagnosis had come when Minho was 5, and since then, Jin had moved mountains to create a safe, predictable world for his son. But business required travel, and today's trip to Los Angeles couldn't be postponed. The cabin door sealed with a mechanical thud that made Minho flinch violently. Tears gathered in the corners of his eyes, threatening to spill over. Jin reached out instinctively, then stopped himself. Sometimes touch helped Minho. Sometimes it made everything worse. "Excuse me." A gentle voice interrupted his internal struggle. Jin looked up to see one of the flight attendants approaching. She was a black woman with warm brown skin and kind eyes, her navy uniform crisp and professional. Her name tag read Aisha. She moved with deliberate slowness, clearly recognizing Minho's distress. "Hi there," Aisha said, crouching down to Minho's eye level, but maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm Aisha. I noticed you might be feeling a little nervous about flying today." Minho peeked at her through his fingers, which he'd pressed against his face. "You know what?" Aisha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have something that might help, but only if you want to see it." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small packet of animal-shaped cookies. "These are special airplane cookies. They're shaped like different animals, and I heard they have magical powers." Despite himself, Minho lowered his hands slightly. "The magic is," Aisha explained with mock seriousness, "they can make airplane rides feel like adventures instead of scary trips. But you have to eat them very slowly and think about which animal you got." Jin watched in amazement as his son's breathing began to slow. No stranger had ever managed to capture Minho's attention like this. Most people either ignored the boy completely or stared with uncomfortable pity. Aisha placed the packet on Minho's tray table without touching him, then stood gracefully. "I'll check on you in a little while, okay? If you need anything, just have your dad press this button." She indicated the call light with a gentle tap. As she moved away to continue her pre-flight duties, Jin found himself studying her profile. There was something magnetic about her presence, a natural warmth that seemed to radiate outward. She handled other passengers with the same professional kindness, but Jin noticed how she'd adjusted her entire approach for Minho. "Appa," Minho whispered, using the Korean word for father. It was the first word he'd spoken since they'd left the house that morning. "Yes, Minhoya." "She's nice." Jin's chest tightened with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Yes, she is." The plane began to taxi, and Minho's grip on the armrests tightened again. But this time he carefully opened the packet of cookies with trembling fingers. A tiny elephant-shaped cookie sat inside. "Elephant," Minho said quietly, showing it to his father. "That's right," Jin replied, his voice softer than usual. "Elephants are very strong and very smart, just like you." As the plane lifted off, Minho nibbled his cookie and watched the ground fall away through the window. For the first time in months of flying, he didn't cry during takeoff. Jin leaned back in his seat, his mind churning. In his world, he was accustomed to reading people quickly, assessing threats and opportunities in seconds. But Aisha Collins had surprised him. She'd seen his son, really seen him, in a way that most people never bothered to try. The flight attendant moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but Jin caught her glancing in their direction periodically. Not with the invasive curiosity he was used to, but with genuine concern. 30 minutes into the flight, turbulence hit. The plane shuddered and dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. Minho's carefully maintained composure shattered instantly. He pressed himself back into his seat, eyes wide with terror, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "Minho, look at me," Jin said firmly but gently. "We're safe. It's just bumpy air, like driving over a rough road." But Minho was already spiraling into panic. His hands flew to his ears, trying to block out the sounds of the engines and the worried murmurs of other passengers. Tears streamed down his cheeks. Jin felt his own heart rate spike, not from the turbulence, but from watching his son's distress. He'd learned to stay calm during Minho's episodes, but it never got easier. "Is everything okay here?" Aisha appeared beside their seats, moving with the same careful grace despite the plane's movement. She'd clearly been watching, and had come over the moment Minho showed signs of distress. "He doesn't like turbulence," Jin explained, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Aisha nodded understanding, and slowly knelt in the aisle beside Minho's seat. "Minho," she said softly, waiting until the boy's tear-filled eyes met hers. "Do you want to see something really cool?" Through his tears, Minho managed a tiny nod. Aisha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. With quick, practiced movements, she began folding it into an intricate shape. Her hands moved steadily despite the plane's motion, and Minho became transfixed watching the transformation. "This is called origami," she explained as she worked. "It's the art of folding paper into beautiful shapes. This one is going to be a crane." Minho's breathing began to slow as he focused on her hands. "In Japan, they believe that if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, your wish will come true," Aisha continued, putting the finishing touches on the delicate bird. "But I think even one crane has a little bit of magic in it." She held up the completed crane, its wings perfectly symmetrical despite being made from a simple napkin. "This one is for courage. When you hold it, you remember that you're braver than you think you are." Minho reached out with trembling fingers and took the paper bird. He held it carefully, as if it might actually fly away. "The turbulence is just the airplane dancing with the wind," Aisha said, her voice maintaining that same soothing cadence. "And you know what? We're almost through it." As if summoned by her words, the plane's movement began to smooth out. The captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the rough patch and assuring everyone that they were now in calmer air. Minho looked down at the crane in his hands, then up at Aisha. "Thank you," he whispered. "You're very welcome," she replied, standing slowly. "You did great. That was some serious bravery." As she moved away, Jin caught her arm gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying more weight than those two simple words usually held. Aisha met his eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond the professional interaction they'd just shared. "He's a special kid," she said simply. "He just needed someone to meet him where he is." After she left, Jin sat in stunned silence. In his world of power plays and calculated moves, genuine kindness was rare. But this woman had shown his son more understanding in 30 minutes than most people managed in a lifetime. Minho had fallen asleep, the paper crane still clutched carefully in his small fist. His face was peaceful now, the earlier panic completely gone. Jin found himself watching Aisha as she continued her duties throughout the cabin. She moved with a natural grace, treating every passenger with the same warm professionalism she'd shown them. But there was something more, an authenticity that drew him in despite himself. For the first time in years, Jin found himself genuinely curious about someone who had nothing to do with his business empire. And that realization was more unsettling than any turbulence the plane could produce. The remainder of the flight passed in relative calm, but Jin couldn't shake his awareness of Aisha's presence. Every time she moved through the cabin, he found his attention drawn to her, the way she anticipated passengers' needs, her genuine smile when she interacted with children, the quiet confidence in her movements. Minho had awakened refreshed, the paper crane never leaving his grasp. He'd even managed to eat some of the airplane meal, which was practically a miracle. Usually, new foods in unfamiliar environments sent him into sensory overload. "Upper," Minho said quietly, tugging on Jin's sleeve. "When will the nice lady come back?" "Her name is Aisha," Jin replied, surprised by how easily her name rolled off his tongue. "She's working, Minho-ya, taking care of all the people on the airplane." Minho nodded solemnly, then returned to carefully examining his origami crane. He'd been studying it for the past hour, tracing the folds with his finger and whispering to it in Korean. Jin's phone buzzed with a text from his second-in-command. "How's the flight? Minho doing okay?" "Better than expected," Jin typed back. "He's actually calm. Miracle." "What changed?" Jin paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. How could he explain that a flight attendant had accomplished in minutes what teams of specialists had been working toward for months? "Just a good day," he finally replied. But it was more than that, and he knew it. There was something about Aisha Collins that had reached through Minho's carefully constructed barriers and found the sweet, curious child underneath. And if Jin was being honest with himself, she'd reached something in him too. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our dessert service shortly," came the announcement over the intercom. Minho perked up at the word dessert. He had a complicated relationship with food, but sweets were one of his safe categories. Jin had learned to use dessert as a reward system, a way to encourage Minho to try new things or push through difficult situations. When Aisha appeared with the dessert cart, Minho's face lit up with genuine excitement. It was the brightest expression Jin had seen from his son in weeks. "Well, hello again," Aisha said warmly, stopping beside their seats. "How are you feeling now?" "Good," Minho replied, holding up his crane. "I kept it safe." "I can see that. You're an excellent crane keeper." Aisha's smile was radiant. "Now, I heard someone might be interested in dessert." The cart was laden with an impressive array of options: chocolate cake, fruit tarts, ice cream cups, cookies, and what appeared to be some kind of Korean sweetbread. Jin leaned forward slightly. "Minho, choose a dessert, anything you want." This was their routine. Minho would carefully examine all the options, ask questions about ingredients and textures, and eventually make his selection. It usually took several minutes of deliberation, but today something different happened. Minho looked at the dessert cart for exactly 3 seconds. Then his gaze moved to Aisha's face. He studied her with the same careful attention he usually reserved for his special interests: trains, origami, and marine biology. Then, without warning, he pointed. Not at the chocolate cake, not at the cookies, directly at Aisha. "I choose her," Minho announced with startling clarity. The words hung in the air like a challenge to gravity itself. Jin's brain struggled to process what had just happened. Aisha's eyes widened in surprise, her hand flying to her heart. "Minho," Jin said carefully, "she's not a dessert. She's a person." "I know," Minho replied matter-of-factly, "but she's sweet, and she makes me feel better. That's what dessert is supposed to do, right?" The logic was so purely Minho, literal, honest, and completely unexpected. Jin felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the airplane's climate control. Aisha knelt down to Minho's level again, her professional composure momentarily forgotten. "That might be the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, her voice slightly thick with emotion. "Really?" Minho asked, tilting his head with curiosity. "Really?" Aisha confirmed, But you know what? I think you still deserve an actual dessert too. What do you say we share? You can pick something from the cart, and I'll sit with you while you eat it, if that's okay with your dad." Minho turned to Jin with hopeful eyes. "Can she, Appa? Can Aisha sit with us?" Jin found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the request. "If she has time in her schedule." "I'll make time," Aisha said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it as more than just professional courtesy. Minho selected the chocolate cake, a safe choice that he'd had before, but instead of eating it immediately, he carefully broke off a small piece and offered it to Aisha. "For you," he said shyly, "because you shared your crane magic with me." Jin watched this exchange with growing amazement. Minho rarely shared food with anyone, not even family members. His autism made him particular about textures, temperatures, and contamination. But here he was, offering cake to a woman he'd met just hours ago. Aisha accepted the piece of cake with the solemnity of someone receiving a precious gift. "Thank you, Minho. This is delicious." As they shared the dessert, Jin found himself studying Aisha more closely. She had an easy way with Minho that didn't feel forced or performative. She followed his conversational tangents about airplane engines and paper folding techniques with genuine interest. When he stimmed by tapping his fingers in complex patterns, she didn't try to stop him or redirect his attention. "Do you have kids?" Jin asked during a lull in Minho's monologue about different types of aircraft. Aisha shook her head. "No, but I work with children sometimes. I volunteer at a community center in Atlanta when I'm not flying. There's something special about seeing the world through their eyes." "Minho sees everything differently," Jin said, his voice carrying a note of protective pride. "It makes some things harder for him, but it also makes him remarkable." "I can tell," Aisha replied, watching as Minho carefully arranged his remaining cake crumbs into geometric patterns. "He has a beautiful mind." The simple acceptance in her words hit Jin harder than he'd expected. Most people saw Minho's differences as problems to be fixed or obstacles to be overcome. But Aisha spoke about his son the way Jin had always hoped others would, as if Minho's uniqueness was a gift rather than a burden. "We should probably let you get back to work," Jin said reluctantly, noticing other passengers beginning to look their way. "Of course," Aisha agreed, but she seemed equally reluctant to end the interaction. "Minho, it was wonderful sharing dessert with you. Thank you for choosing me." "Will I see you again?" Minho asked with the directness that only children could manage. Aisha glanced at Jin, something unreadable passing across her features. "I don't know. Sweetheart, that depends on where you're traveling next. We fly this route sometimes," Jin heard himself saying. "For business." "I work this route every Friday," Aisha replied, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes holding a hint of invitation. "Friday," Minho repeated, as if committing it to memory. "I like Fridays." After Aisha moved on to serve other passengers, Minho settled back into his seat with a contentment Jin rarely saw from him. The boy spent the rest of the flight alternately playing with his origami crane and drawing pictures of airplanes in his sketchbook. But Jin couldn't concentrate on his usual in-flight work. His mind kept returning to the moment when Minho had pointed at Aisha instead of the dessert. His son, who struggled to connect with most people, had chosen her, not just accepted her presence, but actively chosen her. And if Jin was being completely honest with himself, he understood why. There was something magnetic about Aisha Collins, a warmth that seemed to draw people in, a genuine kindness that felt rare in his world of calculated interactions and hidden motives. She'd seen Minho not as a problem to be managed, but as a person to be understood. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Jin made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to see her again, not for business, not for networking, not for any of the strategic reasons that usually motivated his choices. He was going to see her again because his son had chosen her, and because somewhere in the space of a single flight, Jin had begun to understand why. The Los Angeles meeting had gone exactly as Jin had predicted, 3 hours of posturing, negotiation, and carefully worded agreements that would expand his legitimate business interests on the West Coast. But for the first time in his professional life, he'd found his mind wandering during crucial discussions. He kept thinking about Aisha's laugh when Minho had explained his theory about why airplane windows were round instead of square. He remembered the way she'd listened to his son's rambling explanation about crane migration patterns, as if it were the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard. "You seem distracted," his associate observed as they walked through LAX toward their return flight. "The meeting went well, didn't it?" "It went fine," Jin replied, adjusting Minho's noise-cancelling headphones as they navigated the crowded terminal. Minho had been asking about Aisha all week. When would they see her again? Did she work on all airplanes? Could they bring her a present? The questions had been relentless, and Jin had found himself looking forward to Friday with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business. "Appa," Minho tugged on his sleeve as they approached their gate. "Is it Friday?" "Yes, Minho, yeah, it's Friday." "Will Aisha be on our airplane?" "I don't know," Jin answered honestly, though he'd specifically requested this flight time and route. "We'll have to see." But as they boarded the aircraft, Jin's chest tightened with something that felt suspiciously like disappointment. A different crew was working the cabin, and there was no sign of Aisha's warm smile or gentle presence. Minho noticed immediately. His shoulders sagged, and the excited energy he'd been carrying all morning deflated like a punctured balloon. "She's not here," he said quietly, settling into his seat with obvious disappointment. "I know, buddy. Maybe she's working a different flight today." But even as he said it, Jin felt his own disappointment settling in his stomach like a stone. He'd been more invested in seeing her again than he'd wanted to admit. The flight attendant working their section was professional and polite, but the magic of the previous week was absent. Minho ate his animal cookies mechanically and spent most of the flight staring out the window with a melancholy that broke Jin's heart. They were halfway through the flight when turbulence hit again, worse than the previous week. The plane shuddered and dropped, causing several passengers to cry out in alarm. Minho immediately curled into himself, his hands flying to his ears as panic took hold. "Minho, breathe with me," Jin said, trying to project calm while his own heart raced. "In and out, just like we practiced." But Minho was already spiraling. His breathing became rapid and shallow, tears streaming down his face as he rocked back and forth in his seat. The flight attendant approached with concern, but her attempts to help only seemed to make Minho more agitated. "Sir, is there anything we can do?" she asked, clearly out of her depth. "He has autism," Jin explained tersely, his focus entirely on his son. "Turbulence triggers his anxiety." The woman nodded sympathetically, but clearly had no idea how to help. Jin felt helpless, watching his son suffer and knowing that nothing he did seemed to make it better. That's when he heard a familiar voice. "Minho, hey, sweetheart, it's me." Jin looked up in shock to see Aisha moving down the aisle toward them, wearing the same Navy uniform but with slightly different insignia. She must have been working in a different section of the plane. Minho's head snapped up at the sound of her voice, his tear-filled eyes widening with recognition and relief. "Aisha," he gasped, reaching toward her instinctively. "I'm here," she said soothingly, kneeling beside his seat despite the plane's continued movement. "I heard you were having a tough time with the bumpy air." "It's scary," Minho whispered, his breathing still rapid but beginning to slow. "I know it is," Aisha agreed, reaching into her pocket. "But guess what I brought for you?" She pulled out a small paper crane, this one made from beautiful origami paper in shades of blue and silver. "This is a special turbulence crane. It's extra brave because it knows how to fly even when the air gets bumpy." Minho reached for it with trembling hands, clutching it alongside the crane from their previous flight. "Now," Aisha continued, her voice taking on that same magical quality that had captivated Minho before, "I need you to help me with something very important. Can you be my co-pilot?" Minho nodded eagerly, his panic beginning to recede. "Perfect. Co-pilots have a very important job during turbulence. They have to help the plane remember how to dance with the wind instead of fighting it. Can you feel how the plane is moving?" Minho nodded again, his attention completely focused on her words. "Good. Now I need you to breathe with the plane's rhythm. When it goes up, you breathe in. When it settles down, you breathe out. Can you do that for me?" As Minho began to follow her breathing instructions, the turbulence started to ease. Whether it was coincidence or perfect timing, the plane's movement smoothed out just as Minho's breathing returned to normal. "Excellent co-pilot work," Aisha praised, her smile radiant. "You helped the plane find its rhythm again." Minho beamed with pride, his earlier panic completely forgotten. "I helped. You absolutely did. The captain should give you wings for that performance." Jin watched this interaction with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to falling. The way Aisha had appeared exactly when Minho needed her most, the natural ease with which she'd calmed his son's fears, the genuine care in her voice, it all combined to create a perfect storm in Jin's carefully guarded heart. "Thank you," he said quietly when Minho became absorbed in examining his new crane. "No need to thank me," Aisha replied, but her eyes met his with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I was worried about him when I heard there was turbulence. I had to check." "You were worried about him?" "Of course I was." She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He's special." The simple statement hit Jin like a physical blow. In his world, people were always angling for something: access, favors, connections. But Aisha's concern for Minho seemed completely genuine, with no ulterior motive beyond basic human kindness. "I should get back to my section," Aisha said reluctantly. "But Minho, you keep being an excellent co-pilot, okay?" "Okay," Minho agreed happily. "Will you come back?" "If I can," she promised, glancing at Jin with a question in her eyes. After she left, Minho spent the rest of the flight in high spirits, telling anyone who would listen about his important job as co-pilot. But Jin found himself distracted by thoughts of Aisha, the way she'd dropped everything to help his son, the natural warmth in her interactions, the way she made him feel like maybe the world wasn't as cold and calculating as he'd always believed. As they prepared for landing, Minho turned to him with serious eyes. "Appa, I like Aisha." "I know you do, Minhoya. Do you like her too?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Jin felt his carefully constructed walls crumble a little more. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "I like her too." "Good," Minho said with satisfaction. "Then we should keep her." If only it were that simple, Jin thought. But as the plane touched down and he watched Aisha moving through the cabin with her characteristic grace, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, it could be. The question was whether someone like her could ever want anything to do with someone like him once she learned the truth about what he really was. 3 weeks had passed since that second flight, and Jin found himself in unfamiliar territory. He was scheduling business trips around Aisha's work schedule. Every Friday, he and Minho would board the same route, and every Friday, Aisha would find ways to spend time with them despite her professional duties. It had become their ritual. Minho would bring drawings for her, detailed sketches of airplanes and cranes that she would praise with genuine enthusiasm. Aisha would have new origami creations for him, each one accompanied by a story about courage, friendship, or adventure. And Jin would find himself looking forward to these flights with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way Aisha's presence seemed to light up both his and Minho's worlds. But today felt different. Jin had noticed the tension in Aisha's shoulders the moment they'd boarded. Her smile was still warm, her interactions with Minho still genuine, but there was something strained around her eyes. She moved through her duties with the same professionalism, but he could sense an underlying worry that she was trying to hide. "Is Aisha sad?" Minho asked quietly, his perceptive nature picking up on the same subtle changes his father had noticed. "I think she might be worried about something," Jin replied, watching as she served passengers in the forward cabin with slightly less of her usual brightness. "Should we help her?" The question was so purely Minho, his instinct to care for someone who had shown him kindness. "I don't know if we can, buddy, but we can be extra nice to her today." When Aisha reached their section for the beverage service, Minho immediately held up a new drawing he'd made for her. It was a picture of the three of them, standing in front of an airplane, all smiling, with paper cranes flying around them like confetti. "I made this for you," he announced proudly. "It's our airplane family." Aisha's face softened as she took the drawing, and for a moment, her professional mask slipped entirely. "Minho, this is beautiful. Thank you so much." But Jin caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers gripped the paper a little too tightly. "Aisha," he said quietly, "is everything okay?" She glanced around the cabin, then leaned in slightly. "Can I talk to you after the service, both of you?" Jin nodded, concern growing in his chest. An hour later, during a lull in her duties, Aisha returned to their seats. She knelt in the aisle beside Minho, but her attention was divided between the boy and his father. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice carefully controlled. This might be our last flight together for a while. Minho's face fell immediately. Why, are you going away? I might have to, Aisha said gently. I'm having some problems at work. Some of the other flight attendants have been difficult. They've filed complaints about me spending too much time with certain passengers. Jin's jaw tightened. Complaints about spending time with us? Aisha nodded reluctantly. They're saying I'm showing favoritism, that I'm not being professional. My supervisor called me in yesterday for a meeting. But you're the nicest person on the airplane, Minho protested, his voice rising with distress. You help me when I'm scared. I know, sweetheart, and I love helping you, but sometimes grown-ups have complicated rules about work. Jin felt anger building in his chest, a cold, controlled fury that he recognized as dangerous. In his world, problems like this were solved with phone calls, pressure, strategic influence. But this wasn't his world, and Aisha wasn't one of his employees to protect. What can we do? He asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite the storm brewing inside him. Nothing, Aisha said quickly. I don't want you to worry about this. I just wanted you to know in case I'm not on your flights anymore. No! Minho's voice cracked with emotion. You can't go away, you're our friend. Aisha's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. I'll always be your friend, Minho, no matter what happens. But Jin could see the defeat in her posture, the resignation that spoke of someone who'd been fighting an uphill battle for too long, and suddenly he understood that this was about more than just workplace complaints. Aisha, he said quietly, what aren't you telling us? She hesitated, glancing around the cabin again. Some of the complaints. They're not just about professionalism. There have been comments about me spending time with a Korean passenger and his child. Comments about appropriateness. The words hit Jin like ice water. Racism. They were targeting her because she'd shown kindness to him and Minho, because she was a black woman who dared to form a connection with a Korean family. That's not okay, Minho said with startling clarity, his young voice carrying an indignation that mirrored his father's feelings. You're nice to everyone, I watch you. You're right, sweetheart. It's not okay. But sometimes the world isn't fair. Jin's hands clenched into fists in his lap. In his business, he dealt with prejudice and discrimination regularly, the challenges of being Korean in certain circles, the assumptions people made about his background and methods. But this was different. This was someone targeting Aisha for showing kindness to his son. I have connections, he said carefully, people who might be able to help. No, Aisha said firmly. I appreciate the offer, but I need to handle this myself. I don't want to owe anyone favors. The words stung more than Jin expected. She was refusing his help, maintaining her independence even in the face of unfair treatment. Part of him admired her strength. Another part of him was frustrated by his inability to protect her, the way he protected everyone else in his life. What will happen? Minho asked, his voice small and worried. I don't know yet, Aisha admitted. I have another meeting with my supervisor next week. We'll see what they decide. The rest of the flight passed under a cloud of tension. Minho was quieter than usual, clinging to his collection of origami cranes and stealing worried glances at Aisha whenever she passed by. Jin found himself watching the other flight attendants, noting which ones avoided eye contact with Aisha, which ones whispered among themselves when she wasn't looking. As they prepared for landing, Aisha stopped by their seats one more time. Whatever happens, she said to Minho, I want you to remember that you're brave and wonderful, and anyone would be lucky to be your friend. You're brave too, Minho replied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. Braver than the cranes. Aisha's composure finally cracked, a single tear sliding down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. After they'd disembarked, Minho walked beside his father in uncharacteristic silence. It wasn't until they were in the car heading home that he finally spoke. Appa, why are people being mean to Aisha? Jin gripped the steering wheel tighter, struggling to find words that would explain adult cruelty to his innocent son. Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, and sometimes they're mean to people who are different from them. But being different is good. You taught me that. You're right, Minhoya. Being different is good, but not everyone understands that yet. Will Aisha be okay? Jin stared at the road ahead, his mind already working through possibilities, connections, ways he might be able to help despite her refusal. I hope so, buddy. I really hope so. But as they drove through the night, Jin couldn't shake the image of defeat in Aisha's eyes, or the way Minho's small hand had trembled when he'd said goodbye to her. For the first time in years, he felt truly powerless, and he didn't like it at all. The woman who had brought light into their lives was being punished for her kindness, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it without risking making things worse for her. Or was there? Jin spent the weekend in a state of controlled fury, making phone calls and gathering information with the methodical precision he usually reserved for business acquisitions. By Monday morning, he knew everything there was to know about the airline's corporate structure, their diversity and inclusion policies, and the employment history of every flight attendant who had filed complaints against Aisha. What he discovered made his blood boil. The complaints weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern of harassment targeting Aisha that had been going on for months. Comments about her unprofessional hair, criticism of her attitude, suggestions that she was too friendly with certain passengers. The racism was subtle but persistent, designed to create a hostile work environment that would force her to quit. "You're going to get involved, aren't you?" his lieutenant observed, finding Jin in his home office surrounded by printouts and legal documents. "She said she didn't want my help." "That's not what I asked." Jin looked up from the papers, his jaw set with determination. "They're destroying her career because she was kind to my son, because she saw Minho as a person worth caring about instead of a problem to be managed. And because she's black and you're Korean, and some people can't handle that connection. Yes," the word came out flat and hard, "so yes, I'm going to get involved, carefully." Without her knowing, his associate raised an eyebrow. "You're playing with fire, Hyung. If she finds out you went behind her back, then I'll deal with the consequences." Jin's voice carried the same tone he used when making business decisions that others considered too risky. "But I won't stand by and watch her suffer for showing my son kindness." The plan he devised was subtle and multi-layered. A series of anonymous complaints about discriminatory behavior filed with the airline's corporate office. A carefully worded inquiry from a civil rights organization about the company's diversity practices. A sudden interest from several major Korean business associations in the airline's treatment of their members and families. None of it could be traced back to him directly, but the cumulative effect would be impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Minho had been asking about Aisha constantly. When would they see her again? Could they call her? Could they visit her at the airport? His distress over her situation was affecting his sleep, his appetite, his ability to focus on his usual interests. "I want to help Aisha," Minho announced on Wednesday evening, looking up from a drawing he'd been working on. "She helped me, so I should help her." "What did you have in mind, Minho-ya?" "I want to tell her boss that she's the best airplane helper ever. I want to tell them that she makes scared kids feel better, and that's important." Jin's chest tightened with pride and heartbreak. His son's instinct to protect someone who had protected him was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "That's a very good idea," Jin said carefully, "but we need to be smart about how we do it." By Friday, Jin's carefully orchestrated pressure campaign was beginning to show results. The airline's corporate office had launched an investigation into the complaints against Aisha, and several of her harassers had been called in for disciplinary meetings, but he still didn't know if it would be enough to save her job. They boarded their usual Friday flight with a mixture of hope and dread. Minho clutched a new drawing he'd made, a picture of Aisha with wings like an angel, surrounded by all the children she'd helped on airplanes. He'd written "thank you for being kind" in his careful block letters across the bottom, but when they settled into their seats, a different flight attendant approached them. "Excuse me," the woman said, her tone professional but cold. "Are you Mr. Jin?" "Yes." "I need to inform you that there have been complaints about your interactions with our staff. We ask that you limit your requests to essential services only during this flight." Jin felt his temper flare, but before he could respond, Minho spoke up. "Where's Aisha?" he asked, his voice carrying the directness that only children possessed. The flight attendant's expression softened slightly when she looked at Minho, but her tone remained firm. "Ms. Collins is not working this route today. Is she in trouble because she was nice to me?" Minho's question was innocent, but it cut through the woman's professional facade like a knife. That's not something I can discuss." "She helped me when I was scared," Minho continued, his voice growing stronger. She made me paper cranes and taught me how to be brave. If she's in trouble for being nice, then the trouble is wrong. The flight attendant glanced around nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. I'll let my supervisor know about your feedback. After she left, Minho turned to his father with tears in his eyes. They did fire her, didn't they? I don't know, buddy, but we're going to find out. The flight to Los Angeles was the longest of Jin's life. Minho barely spoke, spending most of the time staring out the window with a sadness that broke his father's heart. When they landed, Jin made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of heading to their hotel, he drove straight to the airline's corporate headquarters. Appa, where are we going? Minho asked as they pulled into the parking garage. We're going to help Aisha, Jin replied, his voice carrying the same determination that had built his empire. You said you wanted to tell her boss that she's the best airplane helper ever, so that's what we're going to do. The corporate office was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, designed to intimidate visitors and project power. But Jin had spent his life in buildings like this, and he knew how to navigate their hierarchies. I need to speak with someone about a flight attendant named Aisha Collins, he told the receptionist, his tone carrying just enough authority to suggest that refusing him would be unwise. Do you have an appointment? No, but I have information about a discrimination case that I believe your legal department would want to hear. 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a conference room across from the airline's Director of Human Resources and their Chief Legal Counsel. Minho sat beside his father, clutching his drawing and looking smaller than usual in the adult-sized chairs. Mr. Jin, the HR director began, we understand you have concerns about one of our employees. I do, Jin replied, his voice steady and professional. Aisha Collins has been subjected to workplace harassment and discrimination, and I believe your company has failed to protect her. That's a serious allegation. Do you have evidence to support this claim? Jin slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of every complaint filed against Aisha, along with documentation of the pattern of harassment she'd endured. He'd obtained them through channels he preferred not to discuss, but they were legitimate. This shows a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior targeting Ms. Collins, he said, behavior that escalated after she provided exceptional customer service to my son and me. The legal counsel flipped through the documents, her expression growing more concerned with each page. Furthermore, Jin continued, my son would like to provide a character reference for Ms. Collins. Minho straightened in his chair, suddenly understanding his role. Aisha is the best airplane helper ever, he said, his voice clear and strong. She helps scared kids feel better. She taught me how to be brave when the airplane got bumpy. She makes paper cranes and tells stories, and she's nice to everyone. Not just some people. He held up his drawing. I made this for her because she has wings like an angel. She saved me from being scared, and now she needs someone to save her from being in trouble for being nice. The room fell silent. The HR director's professional composure cracked slightly as she looked at Minho's earnest face and his carefully crafted drawing. Mr. Jin, the legal counsel said finally, we appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We take allegations of discrimination very seriously. I hope so, Jin replied, because if Ms. Collins loses her job due to this harassment, I'll be forced to take this matter to the media. And I think the story of a flight attendant being punished for showing kindness to an autistic child would generate significant public interest. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it wasn't not a threat either. We'll conduct a full investigation, the HR director promised, and we'll ensure that Ms. Collins is treated fairly throughout the process. I want her to come back to our airplane, Minho added, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. She belongs there. She makes everything better. As they left the building, Minho slipped his hand into his father's. Do you think we helped her? I think we did our best, Minho-ya. Sometimes that's all we can do. But Jin's phone was already buzzing with calls from his contacts in the media, the legal community, and the Korean business associations he'd quietly mobilized. The pressure campaign was about to shift into high gear. 2 days later, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Mr. Jin, this is Aisha Collins. Jin's heart stopped. Aisha, how are you? I'm confused, actually. I just got a call from my supervisor. Apparently there's been a full investigation into the complaints against me, and they've been found to be without merit. Several of my colleagues have been disciplined for discriminatory behavior, and I'm being offered a promotion to senior flight attendant. That's wonderful news. It is. But Mr. Jin, did you have anything to do with this? Jin closed his eyes, knowing that this moment would determine everything between them. Minho wanted to help you. He said you helped him, so he should help you. We went to your corporate office and he told them you were the best airplane helper ever. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You went to corporate. For me. You were being punished for showing kindness to my son. I couldn't stand by and let that happen. Another silence, longer this time. Mr. Jin, I don't know what to say. Say you'll be on our flight next Friday. Minho has been asking about you constantly. He's been worried sick. Aisha's voice was thick with emotion. Yes, I'll be there. Good. And Aisha? Yes? Thank you. For seeing Minho the way you do. For caring about him. For being exactly who you are. Thank you, she whispered. For fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself. After he hung up, Jin found Minho in his room, carefully arranging his collection of origami cranes on his desk. Appa, Minho said without looking up, do you think Aisha knows we love her? The question hit Jin like a physical blow. Love. Yes, that's what this feeling was. This fierce protectiveness. This desperate need to see her smile. This way she'd become essential to their happiness. I think she's starting to understand, Jin replied quietly. Good, Minho said with satisfaction, because we're going to keep her forever, right? If she'll have us, Minho-ya. If she'll have us. The next Friday, when they boarded their flight and saw Aisha waiting for them with her radiant smile and a new origami crane for Minho, Jin knew that some choices were worth fighting for. And when she looked at him with tears of gratitude in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for choosing to fight for me," he realized that Minho had been right all along. Sometimes the best dessert wasn't something sweet you could eat. Sometimes it was something sweet you could love. "No one touches what's mine," Jin said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty as he watched Aisha laugh at something Minho had said. "And you, Aisha Collins, are mine to protect." Years had passed since that first flight, when Minho had chosen Aisha over chocolate cake, and the choice had proven to be the beginning of everything beautiful in their lives. The small apartment Aisha had shared with 2 roommates had been replaced by a home filled with laughter, origami cranes hanging from the ceiling, and Minho's artwork covering every available wall space. The boy who had once struggled to connect with strangers now thrived in an environment where he was understood, celebrated, and loved unconditionally. Jin stood in the doorway of their kitchen, watching his wife teach their daughter how to fold paper cranes. 5-year-old Hana had inherited her mother's patience and her brother's artistic eye, her small fingers working carefully to create precise folds in the colorful paper. "Like this, Mama?" Hana asked, holding up her slightly lopsided creation. "Perfect," Aisha replied, pressing a kiss to the little girl's forehead. "Every crane is beautiful in its own way." Minho, now 13 and more confident than Jin had ever imagined possible, looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "That's what you always tell me about people too," he observed, with the wisdom that still surprised adults who didn't know him well. "Because it's true," Aisha said, meeting Jin's eyes across the room with a smile that still made his heart skip beats. "Every person is beautiful in their own way. We just have to take the time to see it." Jin moved into the kitchen, wrapping his arms around his wife from behind and breathing in the scent of her hair. "How was your day?" he murmured against her ear. "Good. I had a little boy on the flight to Chicago who was scared of flying. Reminded me of someone I used to know." She leaned back against his chest, her body fitting perfectly against his. "I gave him a crane and told him about a brave boy named Minho, who taught me that courage comes in all sizes." "Did it help?" His mother cried when she thanked me, said it was the first time he'd smiled in an airplane. Jin tightened his arms around her, still amazed by her capacity for kindness, still grateful that she'd chosen to build a life with them, despite the complications his world sometimes brought. Time had transformed them all. Aisha had not only been reinstated, but had eventually been promoted to a training position, where she specialized in helping flight attendants work with passengers who had special needs. She still flew regularly. But now she also taught others how to see beyond surface differences to the person underneath. "Appa," Minho said, looking up from his math homework. Mrs. Chen asked if you could come speak to our class about business next week. What kind of business? Jin asked, though he suspected he knew where this was going. The good kind, Minho replied with a grin. I told her you help people and make jobs, and that you're not scary like some kids think Korean businessmen are. Aisha laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with warmth. He's been defending your honor at school again. Someone has to, Minho said matter-of-factly. People make assumptions, but I tell them that assumptions are just lazy thinking. And my dad taught me never to be lazy about understanding people. Jin felt his chest tighten with pride. His son had grown into someone who stood up for others, who challenged prejudice with the same directness he'd always possessed, but now with confidence and social skills that had once seemed impossible. I'd be happy to speak to your class, Jin said, ruffling Minho's hair, but only if you promise not to tell them about the time I cried watching you graduate from elementary school. Deal, Minho grinned, but I'm keeping the story about you learning origami just so you could make cranes for Hana. That's blackmail, Jin protested, though his tone was fond. That's family, Aisha corrected, reaching up to cup his face. And we keep each other's secrets and share each other's joys. Hana held up her finished crane, beaming with accomplishment. Look, I made a wish crane. What did you wish for? Minho asked, leaning over to admire his sister's work. I wished for our family to be happy forever and ever, Hana announced with the certainty that only 5-year-olds possessed. That's a good wish, Aisha said softly, her eyes meeting Jin's again. The very best kind. Later that evening, after the children were in bed, Jin and Aisha sat on their back porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Aisha was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, while he played absently with her wedding ring. Do you ever think about that first flight? She asked quietly, when Minho pointed at me instead of the dessert. Every day, Jin replied honestly. It was the moment everything changed, the moment I realized that some connections are worth fighting for. He saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself, Aisha mused. A little boy who barely spoke to strangers chose me. Do you know how that felt? Like coming home? Exactly like that. She tilted her head to look at him. You both saved me, you know. Not just from the job situation, but from a life where I was settling for less than I deserved. You saved us too, Jin said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Minho needed someone who could see past his differences to the amazing person underneath. And I needed someone who could teach me that love doesn't have to be complicated or strategic. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing kindness. And sometimes, Aisha added with a smile in her voice, it's as simple as a little boy choosing a person over chocolate cake. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and listening to the sounds of their neighborhood settling into evening. Inside the house, Minho was probably reading under his covers with a flashlight, and Hana was likely talking to her stuffed animals about the day's adventures. No regrets? Jin asked, the question he'd asked her on their wedding day, on the day they'd brought Hana home from the hospital, on every anniversary since. Only one, Aisha replied, and his heart skipped before she continued with a grin. I should have made more cranes that first day. Minho's collection is getting out of control. Jin laughed, the sound carrying across their backyard and mixing with the evening air. I love you, Aisha Collins. I love you too, Jin. All of you. Every complicated, beautiful, unexpected piece of this life we built together. As they headed inside, Jin caught sight of Minho's latest artwork hanging on the refrigerator, a family portrait showing all 4 of them standing in front of an airplane, surrounded by paper cranes and hearts. At the bottom, in Minho's careful handwriting, were the words, My family chose love.